Hello, Katie back. I'm reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller. There's more background noise today because I am hosting a painting party for in a little under an hour, and I want to keep the heater on, which is a little loud, so background noise, be warned. We are on chapter 6, Pushing Through Solid Rock. Grief is itself a medicine. Can definitely get through this chapter at least, and maybe, next one, see how we do. Many of us face challenges when we approach our grief. The most commonly noted obstacle, perhaps, is that we live in a flat-lying culture, one that avoids depth of feeling. We have compressed the range of our emotional lives to the narrowest band. Consequently, those feelings that rumble deep in our souls as grief get congested there, rarely finding a positive expression, such as a grief ritual. Our culture, which wants to keep us busy and distracted 24 hours a day, keeps shunting grief to the background. We stand in the brightly lit areas of what is familiar and comfortable, not realizing we have lost something essential to the life of the soul. Rilke wrote a moving grief poem over 100 years ago. It's possible in pushing through solid rock, like in flint-like layers as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I see no way through. In no space, everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. Rilke's vivid description of the grief state is remarkable. When we entered the territory of sorrow, especially in those times of intense grief, it feels like we are surrounded by a thick and impenetrable wall of stone. Rilke also recognized that most of us enter this space alone, unaccompanied by people who could help us hold the weight of the time. He goes on from there with a humble confession, a prayer really. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this massive darkness makes me small. You be the master, make yourself fierce, break in. Then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. This poem is filled with self-compassion. Even in the midst of not knowing, he realizes that his grief is a gift to God. The absence of this realization has pushed our grief into regions difficult to access. In these times, it seems like pushing through solid rock simply to feel our sorrows. The collective denial of our underlying emotional life has contributed to an array of troubles and symptoms. What is often diagnosed as depression is actually a low-grade chronic grief locked into the psyche, complete with the ancillary ingredients of shame and despair. Martin Pritchell calls this the gray sky culture. One in which we do not choose to live an exuberant life filled with the wonder of the world and the beauty of day-to-day existence. One in which we do not welcome the sorrow that comes with the inevitable losses that accompany us on our walk here. This refusal to enter the depths has shrunk the visible horizon for many of us, dimmed our participation in the joys and sorrows of the world. We suffer from what I call premature death. We turn away from life and are ambivalent toward the world, neither in it nor out of it, lacking a commitment to fully say yes to life. I remember the difficulty I faced when I attended my first grief ritual. I watched as dozens of men and women fell to their knees, weeping and expressing their sorrow. I could not touch my grief, could not coax it to the surface and onto the ground. I stood there numb, frightened by the raw display of suffering. It wasn't until I participated in my third grief ritual that I was able to release my tears. I needed to keep going, needed to be near the energy of sorrow. I couldn't run away because I was aware that I had a reservoir of grief in my body but lacked the means of freeing it. I realized now how frozen I was, how disconnected I had become from my emotional body. Learning to befriend this vulnerable piece of soul has in turn opened the way to experiencing a much wider array of emotions. Joy, love, anger, sadness, delight, amazement, the entire range of my emotional landscape. The shadow of private pain. There are other factors at work that obscure the free and unfettered expression of grief. In the chapters above, I pointed out that those of us who live in the West are conditioned to accept the notion of private pain. This cultural conditioning predisposes us to maintain a lock on our grief, shackling it in the smallest concealed place in our soul. In our isolation, we deprive ourselves of the very things that we require to stay emotionally vital: community, ritual, nature, compassion, reflection, beauty, and love. Private pain is a legacy of the creed of rugged individualism. In this narrow story, we find ourselves caught in the shadow of the heroic archetype. We are conditioned from birth by the image of the hero, the one who needs no one, the one who rises above his or her pain, the one who is always in control and never vulnerable. We are imprisoned by this image, forced into a fiction of false independence that severs our kinship with the earth, with sensuous reality, and with the myriad wonders of the world. This is a source of grief for many of us. Facing the sorrows of the world requires that we remain intimate with the world. In my practice some years ago, I worked with a woman who is deep in grief about the war in Iraq. She wept and wept about the land being poisoned by fragments of bombs made with depleted uranium. She cried about the hundreds of thousands of civilians killed or wounded by the assault. After sitting with her for some time as she cried, I softly asked her if she had noticed the plum blossoms that were blooming outside the window. She paused and said no. I asked her if she had noticed the mustard in bloom. She replied no. I then said to her, we cannot possibly face the horrors of Iraq with any sense of balance without also remembering the beauty of the world, the plum blossoms and the mustard blooming. We must couple grief with ingratitude in a way that encourages us to stay open to life. I had an opportunity once to work with a group of clergy about the place of grief in their lives. Within a few minutes of starting the talk, there were visible signs of sorrow in the room. I paused and asked what they were feeling. Slowly they revealed the grief that they were carrying. One man had just lost his wife, a woman shared that her divorce had finalized a couple weeks earlier, and another woman said that someone who lived near her had just hung himself and that her son was going in for a brain scan. Another woman shared that a popular restaurant in her town was closing due to bankruptcy and that everyone was feeling the loss. I asked them, how many of you have a place to take your grief? No one raised a hand. We talked for a long time about the idea of private pain. Slowly they came to realize how imprisoning this perspective is to the soul. They wanted more, a way to move into and through their grief, and so we decided to explore ways to bring grief work into their parishes and free their own lives from the grip of the private pain they carry. Giving emotions a bottom. Another facet of our aversion to grief is fear. Hundreds of times in my practice as a therapist, I have heard how fearful people are of dropping into the well of grief. The most frequent comment is, if I go there, I'll never return. What I found myself saying one day was rather surprising. If you don't go there, you'll never return. It seems that our wholesale abandonment of this core emotion has cost us dearly, pressed us toward the surface of our lives. We live superficial lives and feel the gnawing ache of something missing. If we are to return to the richly textured life of soul and to participation with the soul of the world, we must pass through the intense region of grief and sorrow. This requires that we once again put faith in grief. This requires that we give grief a bottom, a foundation upon which to come to rest. Several years ago in my practice, an image came to me of a pair of hands cupped together as if to gather water from a stream. The thought that accompanied the image was that we need to catch and contain the full range of feeling attached to any emotional experience, provide a bottom for it. For example, when we were children and we fell and scraped our knees, we hopefully were able to find someone in whose lap we could climb, a safe place where we were allowed to cry. And if we were fortunate, the caregiver would offer soothing words to let us know that everything would be all right. In that moment, we were able to feel the full weight of our pain and move through that emotional force it carried. In essence, our pain had a bottom, because of that, we could build trust in our ability to move through pain. Now imagine if we had come home as a young teenager after a friend betrayed us or after our first crush rejected us. As we walked through the door carrying our heartbreaking grief, imagining that no one knew how to respond to our sorrow. What if our grief wasn't even acknowledged? Or even worse, what if we were shamed for feeling the way we did? In such a situation, with no love and compassion surrounding us, the holding container for our powerful emotions would never be allowed to take shape. In such circumstances, the grief would begin to feel bottomless, and we would feel panicked whenever it came near our awareness. We would quickly learn to fear the free fall of grief. This feeling of being bottomless, of having no place to stand, no safe container to hold us, can happen with any emotion. Since the scenario has been experienced by so many of us in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, finding a safe container that will enable us once again to build faith in our emotional lives is essential for our well-being. We are brought back to the fundamental practice of self-compassion and learning how to regulate the fear that comes upon us when we move into places of sorrow. Granting ourselves a bottom, through patient attention to our needs, settles us and reassures us that we will be held when we enter the room of grief. We also remember that we can ask for help and support from those who know and love us. As neuroscience continues to discover, we can remodulate our earlier conditioning. Another face of fear is self-consciousness. We live anxiously, wondering who will judge us for who we are, how we act, and what we say. We often do not feel that we belong. We feel that we need to watch everything we do to remain within the parameters of acceptable behavior. Clarissa Pinkola Estes has written as clear and concise a statement of the toxic residue of domestication as I ever came across. Too much time spent in an injection-molded plasticizing culture means that one must swerve every day and hard against being absorbed by learned blindness to the interior life. For many, a weakening of sight, a dropping of the hands, a kind of non-righteous surrender insinuates itself anyway. Pressure to conform for scant reward and/or threats of marginalization because of one's beliefs may force an individual to attempt to assimilate into the least layer of culture, thereby causing one's relationship to all things to slowly become defective. There one becomes disconnected from the observable essence, from the affecting vitality of all things. It is not supposed to be that way for humans. Relationship to all matters and aspects of the world is meant to be complementary, wherein one is able to feel the electricity and the conditions of that electricity inside all things. It's easy to see how the state of wariness and watchfulness interferes with the free expression of emotion. As grief rituals, we repeatedly address this issue. Unconsciously, we often still compare ourselves to others during this work. We notice who is sharing more, being more vulnerable, and succeeding at the task at hand. We're afraid we'll look ugly when we cry. This self-evaluation restricts how fully we can be present in the ritual. We need to be patient with this part of us. Bringing compassion to bear helps to relax the ever-watchful eye of self-criticism and grants us permission to reveal ourselves to others. We may need to tell our friends that we feel this constriction around our chests and throats and that we require support to ease into the full expression of our sorrows. This act itself is a form of self-compassion. The need for communal rituals. Perhaps the most salient obstacle to grieving is the lack of collective practices for the releasing of grief. Unlike most traditional cultures where grief is a regular guest in the community, we have somehow been able to cloister grief and sanitize it, denying its expression as the gut-wrenching and heartbreaking event that it truly is. Even at funerals, we often avoid the intensity of sorrow needed to address the soul's pain surrounding the loss of someone we love. Grief has always been communal and has always been connected with the sacred. As I shared previously, ritual is the means whereby we can work the ground of grief, allowing it to move, shift, and ultimately take a new shape in the soul. At first, the idea of ritual may seem strange to many of us, but when we finally experience it and allow ourselves to become emotionally engaged in the process, we find that there is something familiar about it. Whenever I offer a grief ritual, there is inevitably a feeling of recognition among the participants. This is part of our deep psychic inheritance, part of the unforgotten wisdom of which Jung spoke. It is important to realize that we are hardwired for ritual. Learning to fashion our own rituals emboldens us to go further into the territory of grief. It is a muscle we need to exercise and strengthen. William Blake said, "The deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy." When we send our grief into exile, we simultaneously condemn our lives to an absence of joy. This gray sky existence is intolerable to the soul. It shouts at us daily to do something about it, but in the absence of meaningful ways to respond to sorrow, or from the sheer terror of entering the terrain of grief naked, we turn instead to distraction, addiction, and anesthesia. On my visit to Africa, I remarked to one woman that she had a lot of joy. Her response stunned me. "That's because I cry a lot." This is a very un-American sentiment. She didn't say it was because she shopped a lot, worked a lot, or kept herself busy. Here was Blake in Burkina Faso, sorrow and joy, grief and gratitude side by side. It is indeed the mark of the mature adult to be able to carry those two truths simultaneously. Life is hard, filled with loss and suffering. Life is glorious, stunning, and incomparable. To deny either truth is to live in some fantasy of the ideal, or to be crushed by the weight of pain. Instead, both are true, and it requires a familiarity with both sorrow and joy to fully encompass the full range of being human. Beautiful. Okay, 16 minutes. Wow, what a record. That was a short chapter. I'm going to pause and maybe read one more. This one also seems somewhat short. See you later.